So aside from the Agile with remote teams, I have one announcement from Justin Fahony about Code and Coffee, which is on the East End at 8 a.m. in Squirrel Hill at Commonplace Coffee. So it's every Wednesday at 8 a.m. Come and hang out, hack on anything you want. If you don't have anything, there'll be people there, pair program and just kind of work on stuff in a casual environment. So that's every Wednesday at 8. You can check it out. I think there's a meetup page for it. We can send out info to our group after that. But that's a pretty cool little group if you're more of a morning person and have tech events for filling up the rest of your calendar. So I proposed this topic almost 2 years ago when I started at my current job because I knew I was going to be dealing with a team in San Francisco and Shanghai. And ironically, when I went to update that, I was like, well, I'd like to know about this, and if anybody else doesn't have experience with it, I'm sure I'll have something to talk about in about a month. And ironically, I just put in my 2-week notice, so I'm leaving to go for a startup, which is co-located with 10 people. So, but this is kind of what I've learned in the last 2 years about working with remote teams. And then this morning in my inbox, I got should Agile teams ban telecommuting? So there's been a lot of buzz about this right now in the industry, and in general, I think that after going through all this topic and after being with a lot of remote teams for 2 years, I kind of come to the same conclusion that Craig and Baz did in one of my favorite all-time Agile books, who distilled our experience and advice down to the following: don't do it. And then they go on to say, but if you do, here are ways to help. And this whole book is basically like the Bible for dealing with both extended, scaling Agile, but as well as remote teams and everything like that. I highly recommend it. It even has like really great. I probably pitch this almost every talk I give, but it goes into really deep stuff if you want to learn more about
has joined the conference.
Theory of constraints and all that stuff. So really good stuff. So I, like them, I believe that the best way to work with on an Agile team is co-located, everybody on the same team with your customer, like the Agile Manifesto says. And Marissa Meyer recently made a lot of news talking about how they're no longer going to have their work from home policy. And so that has caused actually more of a stir in the industry than I would have expected. Best Buy also just dropped their work from home policy. They used to have a very highly publicized practice called ROWE, which is Results Only Work Environment. So it's just like, we don't care how you get your work done, it's all about results. The people who pioneered that actually spun off into their own company to promote that, and so they're not very happy that Best Buy is coming back to this. Zappos, which has written an amazing book called Delivering Happiness, and he has some really interesting things about company culture, and they don't do any telecommuting at all. They're all pretty much co-located. And then on the other side of it, you've got 37 Signals, who has very publicly talked about how the best way to get the best people is to get them from anywhere in the world. And so he thinks there are a lot of advantages to having remote people, and in fact, some of the negatives you can deal with, but the positives far outweigh that. GitHub is another big example. They have many amazing presentations about how they work together. I think that the interesting thing with GitHub and 37 Signals is that they're both examples of companies that I would kind of consider to be post-Agile. They have the people that they have in their organization are so advanced, and that they say they don't really follow a process, but when you dig into it, you find out that they're really following a lot of the Agile principles, but not calling it anything. Like, we don't have a process. We just manage everything through pull requests and do all this stuff, and we have continuous delivery and all that stuff. And they're like, but we don't follow a process. And then Richard Branson jumps in line, and who says he's never worked in an office in his entire life. And talks about how if you treat people like adults, basically, then they're motivated to produce high-quality stuff. So he's jumped into the fray. So going back to my experience, so I am from, I currently work at Autodesk. I've got 2 days left. It's a great company. I have nothing bad to say about it. but we do have a lot of the challenges that people with remote teams have. So I manage a small team in Pittsburgh. It was originally a startup. They were acquired by Autodesk a little over 2 years ago. It consisted of like 5 developers, 2 UX guys, and kind of a half UX developer guy. And for a while there, we were working on a product together. We were all just one team working for a much larger organization. We also had a home base back in San Francisco, and we had remote people out in Shanghai. We had a pretty big group out there. So Shanghai basically is 12 hours different, which means you're on a conference call at 8 p.m. and they're at 8 a.m. usually, depending on the time change. So that's kind of my background for the last 2 years. We also had one guy that worked out of his home in Utah. So like for our Scrum team, we had one guy that was always remote, in addition to all the other teams that we interfaced with. So that's a little bit of a background. And if at any time you have any questions or want to like weigh in on something, like this is mostly from my experience, because there's like a whole bunch of stuff you can talk about for remote workers. If you have anything to add to it, feel free to just interrupt me. I'll repeat it for the people that are on the phone. So what I kind of came up with are like 3 principles for what I think you need to have an effective remote team situation. And the first one is really communication. You could almost boil down every problem with remote teams to communication, but this is kind of like dealing with people remotely, and usually over digital means or AV equipment or anything like that. So I think the biggest thing from the beginning is having empathy towards the people that you're working with. Always assume positive intentions. If things start to get heated over email, assume that they're working through something. Pick up the phone and talk to them. Like basically, it's all about working with people, and you should never like just let an email thread get out of control. So the other big thing is trust, and I find that it's much harder to trust people when it becomes an us versus them thing, which can happen very quickly with remote teams. And I think that it's really surprising. Whenever we go back to our home base in San Francisco, we usually come back and we joke that people have checked for the implants, because they've come back from San Francisco just drinking the Kool-Aid, and they're all excited about what they're working on before. And it's really just like once you meet and talk with people about strategy and stuff like that, then you're kind of infused with what everybody's doing, and that I think is a really big point about how to get everybody on board, which I'll get to in a second. And so I think that team visits are critical, and I think that there are certain points along the way that they are most important, and that's usually at the beginning of a project, and then at the end of a project to celebrate it, but more importantly at the beginning of a project to kick it off, do the brainstorming and team building, and get to work with the people that you're going to be working with throughout. So from a communication perspective, I think that there are so many different options to talk to people. I was saying before we started here, when you go to set up a meeting, you've got all these different tools at your disposal, screen sharing. Are we just going to pick up a conference phone and do it all audio, all that stuff? But even throughout your day, you've got instant messenger, chat rooms, which I think are really important, email, phone, meeting, and wiki. So those are kind of like escalating in like how asynchronous they are. And I think that it's really important to consider the medium and for what it's used for. I don't think an email thread should ever get very long before you pick up a phone or schedule a meeting. A lot of developers are averse to meetings, but I think that you have to have them more frequently when you have remote teams so that things don't get out of control and there are misunderstandings. In addition to that, whenever we're working with a remote team where we intersect, so this is really like interdependencies between teams. We have weekly or bi-weekly tactical meetings, which is basically just always having that check-in, and we have a process for going through that I'll talk about a little bit later. But having that forced check-in time, I know that's another thing that a lot of people hate is standing meetings, but this really forces you to say, how are things going, what's the status, and are we driving towards these same goals that we had identified at the beginning of a project. So the second big thing that I think is important is clarity. Um, and clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities is my number one pet peeve. I think that where disagreements happen in remote situations is usually when it falls between two groups, and there's disagreement about who's in charge of that thing. More importantly is who is in charge of prioritizing the backlog or whatever. We have a pretty large company, and we often ask the question, who's driving the bus? And it's depending on who you ask, they could be like, well, it's the product manager, or well, it's the PO, or it's this group that we've created over here called a SWAT team. And it changes over time, and that's really frustrating. And I think that that's something that needs to be defined early on, and then it's clear that you're accountable and have authority for whatever roles you've agreed on. So making clear guiding principles, and this is kind of, regardless of whether you have a remote team or not, but I find that a lot of the disagreements that tend to arise more frequently between teams is when you really just have like philosophical differences that you haven't really like put out front. So I kind of try to come up with a set of things that I believe that may be controversial. Maybe most people are on board with these, but that's not always the case. So a big one for me, well, quality over scope and deadlines, that's like an obvious Agile one. A lot of these are very similar to the Agile manifesto. Same with sustainable pace. But we have a little bit of a culture at Autodesk of, we're pushing for a deadline, and then somebody puts on their cape on a weekend and bangs out some code and deploys it, and it's like, that's great, until everything doesn't work. So the other big one here, the customer development one, which comes from the lean startup, you can think of it as user experience, user research. I've heard many times our users don't know what they want. If we listened to them, it would have made a faster horse, blah, blah, blah. I actually had another talk that we were going to put together about how Henry Ford actually did build a faster horse, but that's another topic there. I truly believe in these things, and I think that if you don't agree with them, then we can have a conversation about why it's different for that situation. But I think that not addressing these early on can lead to more friction. So priorities goes hand in hand with roles and responsibilities, but I think that as you scale and have remote teams, if you're not clear on the priorities, then you don't feel like what you're working on is necessarily the most important thing, and then priorities can change. So I think that it's really important to have a clear pipeline down from the top vision down to the developers and the Agile team. And then make everything visible. So there's the idea of information radiators that you see around the room here when you're dealing with remote teams. You need to have something digital that people can go to. Maybe you probably have lots of things that are digital, and sometimes that's even more of a problem because you have information overload. In my case, we have a tool that I wrote called Radiator, which is an open source dashboard. You've probably seen similar things out there. Maybe there's Gecko Board, which is very similar to this. There's some paid things that have popped up. But the basic idea here is that you get the high-level questions answered, and you can go to it at any time and see what's up. So I basically have on this thing, I have at the top, we have a high-level Kanban board, basically, for our epics. And so you can see, like, that's kind of the executive level thing up top. It's like, what are people working on and what's coming up next at a big grain level. The next one, that's actually a prototype. I never did that. But that's a parking lot diagram, which has a lot of different information about project, the percentage done, and whether they're at risk or not. So it's a really interesting thing if you want to look into parking lot diagrams for a lot of information in a small amount of space. And then timeline, when events are coming up, and a clock, world clock, because we have Utah and Shanghai and San Francisco, and then there's backlog and velocity stuff below that. But basically the idea is that figure out what those questions that you need to answer frequently are, and just answer them automatically so that people can always go.
Is that compatible with TFS, which is what we use to track our backlog?
So it's very customizable. Which means that it's all Ruby code, and then it uses a widget framework. So if there's an API, you can connect to it and make it display, and just kind of stick it there. It's, it doesn't have a GUI for creating things. It's not like super sophisticated, but on the other end of it, you can basically make a widget for anything you can connect to. And then finally, my favorite all-time Agile diagram is getting people on the same page, which people, if you can't read that down there, it says, oh yeah, I guess we're all in agreement then, and they're all imagining a different shape. And then when they actually draw it on the board, they realize that they're not. And I think that this is one of my meeting principles. And this is something that took me a long time to learn while I was there, but it is super powerful to just be in a meeting where you've got people on the phone and you're sharing, and well, we don't have anything to present, so we're just going to do it audio. It's like, just if you do a screen share and just take notes so that everybody can see your notes, then they can correct you when you get like something, oh no, that's not quite right, and like that has smoothed over so many disagreements that I highly recommend that. And then afterward, you have a record of what you agreed. And there's a really cool meeting template from the book Death by Meetings that I'll show a little bit later for organizing that kind of thing. And then the third pillar that I came up with is basically, like, when I distilled all these together, it's really just good business practices. So this is like not specific to Agile teams, but it becomes more critical. I mean, remote Agile teams, but it becomes more critical when you're dealing with lots of separate teams. So having a clear vision and communicating that to people seems fairly basic, but a lot can happen between somebody saying a high-level vision and people implementing it. And so seeing that alignment, I think, is really important. And having everybody know what your business plan is. And in the lean Agile world, there's a really cool tool that Ash Maurya made in the lean startup, where it basically takes a business model canvas and adapts it slightly for lean. And even as a tool out there, like you can get like one of these for free and you can update it. The idea here is that you should be able to make your lean canvas and answer these big questions like, what's our problem, what's our solution, all this stuff. You should be able to fill this out in about a half an hour. And then people aren't confused about who their top customers are. But I think that a lot of teams wouldn't be able to answer this. And so then doing those things, the vision and the business plan, helps you get the team buy-in. I've seen a lot where people are questioning the senior management. And I think that if you don't get that team buy-in, you're really selling the whole project short. I think a lot of times they're like, well, we're going to come down with this vision, and you guys are going to implement it. That's how our roles work. But I think that if the team knows why we're making something, they can make those little micro decisions on the ground, which is what one of the big downsides of working remotely is, that you aren't all talking with your customer advocate all the time. So you have to make that crystal clear about who your top customers are, preferably in priority order. So if you have to make those trade-offs during development, you know why, what the end goal is. And then I think this is my last bit here for business practices, is like how to run a good meeting. There's a book that used to be free. I think it's $7 now. A really short book that you actually could read before your next meeting, but just generally good advice about running meetings. I think that like I said before, you should jump to a meeting quicker if they're remote, so you can settle any disagreements. But that means that you should be super efficient about having them. Don't meet if you don't need to. The important thing from their book was you should never have an informational meeting. You should send a memo instead. Every meeting should have action items, because that's the point. It's kind of like giving a talk. What are you trying to do? You're trying to inform, entertain, or persuade. At a meeting, you generally want to make decisions. And all those other good things there: distribute an agenda, action items, and starting and ending on time. That's a hard one. So there's this really good template that we use at our company. We do this for our tactical meetings, which is that every week or 2 weeks we usually employ this. for the ones where we meet with other teams. We may not know the other teams that well, but so it's really important to make sure that we are all agreed on what we're trying to do together. And this allows you to run a very quick meeting, but also allows you to keep track of the measurable things from week to week. So basically at a high level, you start out the meeting, you go through a lightning round, everybody says things that are on their mind, and then you have this area over here, the scoreboard, where you track things, and you have like red, yellow, green status. You decide what are like the 5 to 7 things that we're tracking for these teams, and they're usually like the longer running stories. But since we don't often have the same process as other teams, at least in our company, you can't just like look into their backlog or whatever. So maybe everybody's doing the same thing and this isn't an issue for you. But even so, like if you're just trying to track something that's going to take like several months, this is a really useful template. And any questions so far about that stuff? So those are kind of my 3 principles, and I'm going to go into a little bit about how we work with our process and our tools. But
Ari said repeat the question.
oh yeah, good idea.
I was just going to ask if you can get your slides.
Yeah, totally. The question was, can we get the slides afterwards? I have a couple of things in here that show some sensitive information that I probably need to scrub before I do that. I thought they would go quickly on here and it wouldn't be a big deal. But I will totally get those out within a week, less than a week, maybe a day. You can write me an action item for that.
Are you going to get into juxtapositioning the stand-up and whether or not it overlaps and how it like sort of the Agile ceremonies, what you practice, what gets thrown out the door as a result of remote?
That's a good question. I wasn't going to go into that specifically, but when I talk about stand-up, I'll try to think about that stuff because that was a concern. That was something that we kind of, yeah. I'll talk about that when I get to stand-up. Thanks for that suggestion. Nivea was asking about what kind of Agile ceremonies that we have to modify or get rid of with remote teams. So the next thing I'm going to talk about here is our process and the tools that we use to cope. And was there any other questions before we go into that? In the back there?
I do have a comment.
Yeah.
Of the companies that you showed, into companies that support and companies that don't. It's interesting that the 2 companies that do support 37 signals and GitHub, both of them have products for GitHub as a distributed source control system, right? Base 37 signals as base just for distribution. Kind of interesting.
Yeah. And to add on to that, the comment was that it's interesting that the teams that support remote work both have products that are geared towards people that work remotely, GitHub and 37 Signals. And to add on to that, the other thing that I saw in all this news about Marissa Meyer's comment was they mentioned other teams that have done really well with open source models. And these teams both come from an open source world. So they're used to that digital interaction, the asynchronous communication, and they're like, this is just the way we work.
So you guys practice Scrum and what as Agile?
Oh yeah, good question. We actually practice, the question was do we practice Scrum or some variant. So our team practices a fairly faithful version of Scrum. We do 2-week iterations. We have the stand-ups. I think that the only main ceremony thing we don't do is burn down charts. Go ahead.
So you have teams in Shanghai as a couple of locations, right? So is it one Scrum team or are those distinct Scrum teams? Like what combination? How many members?
Yeah, the question was, what is the composition of the other teams around the world? Is it one big Scrum team or not? So we tend to have, our Scrum teams tend to be about the recommended size of 7 plus or minus 2 people. We tend to have we tend to have product owners on each team. We often share responsibilities like a lot of people do, but you're not supposed to. But we even we have named Scrum Masters. I'm a Scrum Master and Dev Manager. We have a couple teams that have experimented with Kanban, and a couple of teams that are still doing that. One of the conflicts is, well, we'd like to get everybody using the same system for tools, And so like we want everybody entering in the bugs here and have their backlogs here so they can see them. I kind of fight against that. But
Why?
because I think that what they really want, actually, I'll go into that in a little bit. But since you asked now, the reason that I fight for that is because I think that tools are a way to get things done, and they're very personal based on your team. Everybody's team is a little bit different, and I think that what people really want is to be able to answer questions like those business level questions. And so what I propose is that as long as you can answer those questions on demand, then it doesn't matter what's used underneath the surface. And so that's where my answer was Radiator, because it's like, what do you want to know? You want to know what are you working on? When's this going to be done? What's on your roadmap? You know, all that stuff. But they're higher level questions. And yeah, so Shanghai's got a couple Scrum teams that we interact with. They have a lot of people in Shanghai. We only operate with a couple, like one or two of the Scrum teams. Autodesk is also fairly well siloed into functional groups, so we don't do very well at doing vertical slices. You know, I work on the cloud platforms team, and specifically the viewing component of it. So we have a viewing component, we've got a storage component, we've got an identity, we've got a compute grid, translation. These are all separate teams, and they sound very much like siloed functional teams. What's that? Yeah, they're effectively horizontal slices. And in some sense, it's like if you read about the how Amazon works internally, how they have all the APIs talking between things. So if we worked in that way, like, and the other side of that is that most engineering systems end up looking like their organization. So like your components will resemble your human organization, and that's very true in our case. Here.
You were talking about the different Scrum teams that you have, and it sounds like they're mixed. So do you have one Scrum team that does span across geographic areas, though? So you have members of that team scattered?
Some do. So on the viewing team, we have everybody but one person in Pittsburgh. One person's in Utah, so he's out there by himself. Our translation team goes. They have people in Toronto, San Francisco, and Utah. The Utah guy goes between them. He kind of participates in both right now. I think that right now the Shanghai team for translation has like an independent thing, so they tend to try to keep them grouped. There will be some stratification across teams, but not a lot. The tendency that definitely seems to be trying to get people co-located as much as possible into independent units.
So when you say you have teams at Shanghai,
yeah,
do you have do they report directly to you, or is there a Scrum Master who manages that team and you manage the Scrum Master?
The question was, in the Shanghai teams, do they report to me, or do they have their own line report and Scrum Master? And the Shanghai teams that I've worked with have their own Scrum Master and Dev Manager and everything. They're all they're kind of autonomous over there, and we're working with them.
So you are managing mostly the product owner and Scrum Master. That's your interaction.
Yeah. So like when I worked closely with the Shanghai team, I had weekly calls with Shanghai's Dev Manager and their QA Manager. So that's another thing that we have is we've also split up into people will report to their functional manager. I used to have a QA guy, 2 UX guys, and 5 developers, and then we split into QA reports to a QA manager, UX reports to UX manager, devs report to dev manager, but you're all on one Scrum team.
Why did you move? That seems to be a reverse of a trend. Why did you move in that direction?
So I'm not exactly sure. But I would say that one of the benefits of that I've read about is that they can, you're working with people who are experienced in their field and they can help mentor the people about that particular craft. You know, our QA group is definitely shifting more toward a developer QA role, where they're like writing automated tests and test systems. So that they're definitely we're definitely trying to move away from manual testers as much as possible. And my dream with the pure Agile side was to everybody pitches in with QA and stuff, and I tried to limit work in progress so that people had to chip in and stuff. But unfortunately, our QA guy was so good that it never really happened. So like he was able to handle all the load. But yeah. So.
In regards to how you said your teams, how does that work then? Taking those back on where the issue where you don't have enough work, or that's kind of work expenses.
Yeah. Totally. The question was, since we work in horizontal slices, how do we work with that next big item off the backlog, and do we run into trouble? Yes, we ran into a really big problem recently where the next big thing was supposed to span viewing and translation teams, and we went forward with the viewing piece of it, and then at the end of it, when we finished it, we could not put it into any product because the translation piece never really got staffed at all. There was like, we have nobody to do this work. And so it sits there today after like 4 months not being able to go into any product. So it is a very real cost. I think that kind of goes back to why I harp a little bit on making sure you have the roles and responsibilities and priorities, right? I think that we're moving in that direction with the high-level Epic backlog, and making sure that when we pick off that big Epic thing, that we make sure that everybody has that in their backlogs and have a reasonable approach to getting it done.
Have you experimented with different ways that successful?
Question was, have we experimented with different ways that were successful? I haven't personally at this company. Do you have any? Have you had any experience with that?
No, I mean most of my experience trying to get people to
yeah.
But no, I haven't.
Yeah, no, I definitely don't have all the answers. So.
We also use the Epic backlog. We have a single Epic level backlog, or we call it feature level backlog. And what we do is we map, we tie the two together. I mean, you don't have to use TFS, you can use whatever, you can use Stream even to connect the two. But as long as there's a connectivity to the master backlog, we found that keeps the traceability going, and keeps everybody at least on the same page. So we do it by directly linking the two features together, which is a functionality TFS provides. A lot of other Agile management templates also provide something similar.
So you have
right. Yeah, so we have a master backlog called the feature, the feature level product backlog, and from that each team has their own product backlog, and then beneath that, the sprint backlog. I mean, it sounds more complicated than it actually is, because what you do is you create everything at the Epic level, because that's where the business value resides anyway, and all you do is copy from that. So from the feature level backlog, you copy to the product backlog, because that's how we route the work. So we have different teams, and all the teams can pretty much, for the most part, handle the different types of work, because we're fairly vertically sliced that way. And so as you move the work, you just move it to that team's backlog, but keep the tie to the Epic level. And then when the team accepts the story, you just move it to the front backlog. If that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Is it, or, oh,
do you have any
one more question. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Do you have any experience, or maybe cover it, with Scrum team that is two different locations like for instance, are half-hour developers and QA and so they start their day, we're sleeping at 2 o'clock in the morning, right?
Yeah.
They have a question at the beginning of the day on some feature or something they're doing, they can't get beyond, they waste more than half their day by the time we get an answer. Do you have any?
Yeah, so the question was, when you have people in India or a vastly different time zone, they run into a question, they waste half their day. I don't have a big answer for that one. The one thing that we had when we had a Shanghai team, we tried really hard to stay up late to answer questions. So
It's not very sustainable.
this was only for a project with a really hard delivery target, and the idea was I'll stay up and check my email until 9, so we have like an hour window to like ask any clarifying questions during that time period. And they basically weren't allowed to sleep during that time period, so they were always up on the other side. That's only partially a joke. I'm gonna move forward, and then we can do some more questions at the end. So getting into, let's see, I think we're okay on time. So getting into the process that I work with is, the first thing is identifying your channels. So what I mean by this, in our case, this goes back to my thing about prioritization. We get stuff, we have dependent customers all over our organization. We've got bugs coming in. We have feature requests from different departments. So I think that you need to get a handle on where your channels are coming in, and then who makes the call on how they go into your backlog. That's something that we've really struggled with, because it usually comes down to somebody who has a larger personality influencing what goes into the backlog. So as long as you have that who makes the call in line there and can say these are the way that things are coming in, then I think that things can go a lot smoother. So we talked a little bit about the high-level backlog. This is what a close-up view of our Epic backlog, and this was my goal with this thing. The design of this is to be executive friendly. So it basically takes what's in our other system but strips out all the editing controls, and it's just like clear, color-coded based on which group it's coming from, and just hover for a basic description and any status on it. So project inception, there's this wonderful book called The Agile Samurai, which I also promote at almost every talk I give. And they have one of the most useful tools for Agile that they don't teach in most Agile classes, which is the Inception deck. There are 10 questions. These are 6 of the ones I like the most that you ask at the beginning of a project. And this is something that you should be able to arrive at more on the order of those teams visits that I said are so important for remote teams. Get them together for 2 or 3 days, and then you should end up with about answering these 10 questions. And I think that if we had done this for some of our projects, we would have headed off a lot of problems. So just a sampling here is like, why are we here? Which is just like, what are we doing? What's the big thing? The elevator pitch, in and out of scope. That's called the not list, because it's, in traditional waterfall projects, people would tend to try to put everything in the must-have list. I don't know if anybody has experience with must-have lists. So that one is like, hey, look, this is explicitly what we're not going to do, and then any questions that you have unresolved during that 2 to 3 day offsite, you can address those as you get going. Trade-off sliders, I love that one, which is like, hey, what's going to give? I hope you don't say quality. We actually did. We did actually get to a point where we were nearing a deadline where I was told to scale back on quality, which made me very sad. But basically, the other one that I think, this is something that I always wanted to do but never got around to, was making like a real visual of your project community. We work with so many different teams that it's hard to remember which team a person is on. And it's like, you're with what team now? And what's your role on that team? And what I really wanted to have was like this architectural map overlaying on top of a people map, where you could know who to go to talk about certain things. Monthly science fairs. This is a take on the sprint review that you can do with multiple teams. We did this once at my last job when I worked at Vivissimo, and it was really successful. The basic idea is like a science fair. You set up in a room, and you go through and look at all like the sandwich boards. You have a laptop set up. You can demo what you've done, and these are a little less regular than an iteration. Maybe it's once a month. We are just going to start this off again at Autodesk, and we talked about, initially I was like, I don't think this will work well remotely. The idea is that you get a bunch of people together, you get some beers, and you talk about things. Do it on like a Friday afternoon. they felt pretty strongly about getting remote people in there. So what we ended up on was there's a really good blog post which I'll try to remember to send out. Remind me if I don't. But basically somebody who did do that remotely, and there are certain things, and he had gone through a year of doing this and things that he'd learned about how to run a good science fair, including remote people. Initially he started with PowerPoint slides, but then he went to like enforcing people to show demos of something. So I think that's a really interesting thing that works pretty well to get, so you have an idea of what other teams are doing that you're interdependent on. And then the other cool thing that I think that we do at Autodesk is we have an internal open source model. We use GitHub Enterprise, and we communicate through pull requests. Now there's a really great GitHub's presentation, how GitHub uses GitHub to build GitHub. And it is fantastic. It's spread around the internet all the time, but they use it for much more than we do. And I think that this is something that could really help us with some of the pains that we have with our user experience communication. UX right now has to communicate with Shanghai, and they have a lot of strain with putting their designs the other way around the world and hoping that they get implemented the way they'd imagine them. So pull request is basically a discussion. And if you don't know what a pull request is, in the GitHub world, the idea is that you can take a piece of code, you can fork it into a copy, make some changes, and then submit a request to pull in your changes. So a pull request on GitHub specifically also has threading, comments, you can post pictures, you can add additional commits, or like, oh, you know, I think you need to check for this, blah, blah, blah. He's like, okay, no problem. He fixes up his commit and he puts it back. There's amazing examples of features that have gone for 8 months of on a single pull request of just like pages and pages of discussion. And that is one of the things that is really important for remote teams, is having things documented, making everything visible. So they use it for discussion, code review, which is the obvious thing that pull requests are for. At the basic level, it's an automatic code review. I'm submitting this pull request, is it okay? And then the other thing that I think is really a potential big win is design, where you could actually have that asynchronous, you know, here's the screenshot of what I'm talking about, and then, you know, they implement it. And so intermixing UX artifacts into pull requests. And then, so that was the basic part about our process. Talking about tools, we're going to get into process too, and then maybe we'll cycle back and open up for some questions. So as the Agile Manifesto says, one of the 4 things is individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And so I go back on my soapbox about letting people use the tools that they work best with, but being able to answer the questions that business and your stakeholders want to know. And so I showed a screenshot earlier of our status dashboard, which is using Radiator. We use Pivotal Tracker for all of our, for my team's backlog. A lot of teams use Jira. Some teams use Rally. There's an effort right now to standardize on that, which I'm a little sad about. GitHub Enterprise, which is outrageously expensive. We're kind of working right now to see if we can host our code outside of the firewall on GitHub Private, which is actually much cheaper. But that's a really great tool for communicating asynchronously with remote teams. Team Chat, which is probably one of the most important things, I think, for making a remote team feel like part of a team. So one of the first teams that I worked on outside of out in the real world, they had an IRC room. People were in there all the time. You can ask questions. They all worked in an office, but they were always on it all the time. I was a remote contractor. It felt like I was there with the team. You get the team culture. You get you can ask questions at any time. You can ping somebody with their name. With HipChat, which is basically like a user-friendly version of IRC, which I highly recommend. You can has the same killer features, which means you can ignore it when you're working, and if somebody really needs to get in touch with you, they can say your name and you'll get an alert. It's even more is if you're idle, you can get that alert through email or your phone in a push notification, which is awesome. They also have custom emoticons, and we have even animated ones, which is really fun. we do our daily stand-up on Google Hangouts. We used to do Skype. This is an actual Hangout that we had. When we first started using it, we had a lot of fun with the effects. We don't do that as much anymore. But that's our guy from Utah working out of his home office. And what we did originally with our stand-ups, which we do at noon, because he's 2 hours back time zone. We used to have stand-up people from San Francisco, which are 3 hours back. So we said, well, 9 a.m. your time, just before lunch our time. So we really didn't want to split up the morning or the afternoon, and noon worked really well. So for us, we have a stand-up, then we go get lunch. I prefer a stand-up in the morning, but noon actually tends to work pretty well too. So yeah, so we do that every day. Actually, like I've circled back on this a number of times and been like, do we really need a daily stand-up if we've got chat all the time, we've got email, we've got all these other methods, and I always try to make the team make those decisions. And because I act as Scrum Master and Dev Manager, I want them to be empowered. And they say, you know what? It seems like we wouldn't need to because we can go and talk to people and chat and stuff, but stuff comes up in stand-ups, and it continues to. So we still find them to be pretty useful. Well, what I was going to say is that we used to just do it by our whiteboard where we had sticky notes that we kept in sync with Pivotal Tracker, and we had him on a laptop. And at one point we realized that, he's sometimes it's hard to hear when people are in here, hard to tell who's talking. So when we found out that Google Hangouts became more reliable for more people, we tried that out for a little bit and realized that we're all on the same playing field at that point. So he's not the remote guy, and we're the Pittsburgh guys. And so then we're all on the same playing field. So I think that was really important. Another collaboration tool, which is surprisingly good, is Google Drawings. So I just did a session with an architect who's based in Ithaca, New York, about 2 weeks ago. We're like, how are we gonna do this big thing that crosses 3 different teams? And the color-coded stuff is basically the different teams that are responsible for things. But you can work on these diagrams, and it kind of blew him away that he can see me editing it while he's watching it. So this is not doing any screen sharing at all. It's just updating in real time. And we basically sketched out an architecture diagram in about 15 minutes, and that's awesome, and it's free. So highly recommend that. And so that's all I have for the tool side of it. So I found we've gone through a number of things. We used Skype for a while. We hate Skype. It was useful for a bit, but once Google Hangouts started being viable, we were happy to switch to that. And it's not without its flaws, but go ahead.
You say stand up using Google Hangouts, and now everybody's on the playing field. That means you guys who are all the parts that are co-located sit at your desk. Really? Yeah.
The question was, do we sit at our desks while we do Hangouts? And we do. The downside with that is that you hear other people's echoes, so you have to mute your mic. But everybody has their headphones in, and we all get on a Hangout.
And even though you're in the same group.
Yep, we're all in the same room. And he said it's been, like, our remote guy said it's been great, and it doesn't really detract from us. We just have to get good at the muting and unmuting. But, what, a question in the back?
Yeah, you find that Hangouts is more reliable than Skype? We have heard people that we're able to work from home for one. And this is all a transition we're going through. We're trying to Skype right now, and you try to get people on the phone, it just hangs, doesn't connect, and I'm kind of sick of it. So is Google Hangouts a little more reliable?
The question is Google Hangouts more reliable than Skype? Skype tends to hang quite a bit. For me, it wasn't completely reliable, but it was more about the interface of getting people set up with Skype every time was so hard. But here we can just send out a link. And at first when we tried it, it was not very good. The video quality was pretty bad, keeping up with the audio. I think it's gotten significantly better in the last 6 months or so, to the point that it's pretty smooth. And yeah, there are ways you can set up a Google Hangout in advance, but I don't think you can do it for a standing meeting. I think the room goes away after a while, which is a little unfortunate. But if you had to schedule a meeting ahead of time, you could say, hey, at 3 o'clock, here's a Google Hangout, and then people will have that link, which is actually another tip that I didn't talk about at meetings. It's so frustrating to walk into a meeting room and spend the first 5 to 7 minutes setting up screen sharing. And some of the tools that we have, like we use Microsoft Link, which works pretty well for that. You can send out a link ahead of time, and then it's like, hey, this is what we're using. Here's the call and information. That's like basic, business, telecom practices, but it's amazing how many people skip that. And so like just standardizing on a tool. Actually, you don't even need to standardize. You could send out a GoToMeeting link or whatever, as long as you do it ahead of time. But to answer your question, I'm a fan of Google Hangouts. It's not perfect, but I think it's better than Skype.
Hi.
Other questions?
From the Hangout.
So I've worked with a lot of companies that
you hear me?
some companies where
Mhm.
the ones that I see fail, they want it all being the hands of the project manager. They don't want to make the initiative to provide the right tools to get tools. You get one of the tools.
Mhm.
None of these tools work right if you don't have a reliable internet connection, if you don't have reliable servers.
Yeah.
Servers can't be at the main site if you have somebody who needs to access the manager. Somebody they can't access that server and they want to put up a simple file and get a simple file down and take 20 minutes. So the last company I worked for where we had a lot of problems, Skype was one of our big problems, and I would usually have to set up a meeting a half hour before we actually had a meeting.
Mhm.
And the biggest challenge was if somebody's listening to Spotify in one part of the office, another page, I was watching Netflix, that means you have no internet connection properly to actually get through to the other team members. And that ended up making everyone angry. It ended up the remote team members felt alienated because they were like, we can't access you guys can all talk together and things like that. So that is not only companies jumped in saying, yes, we have remote teams, but then they don't want to take the initiative and they just think staying with one remote team and using all the software is out.
Yeah, so for the people on the phone there, the big message there is that the teams that have failed with remote teams is that they haven't had the reliable infrastructure for being able to run all of these remote tools with bandwidth and all of that stuff. And actually, the Google Docs thing, you reminded me, the Shanghai team can't access it behind the Great Firewall. So we've had to, for this, we would export to PDF and email it. But for the most part, yeah, we actually the same is true for shares. We had to be careful about shared drives that are accessible to them. Yeah, but that takes me into challenges, which is my last bit here. We're almost out of our prescribed time, almost done. And these are just a quick list of things that I think that are still problems, at least for me. Inter-team dependencies. I mentioned that we have a lot of horizontal slices, which creates natural silos. Prioritization, which I've harped on a number of times. I think that that's a really important one to get right. And then getting the team buy-in, which is communicating the vision and communicating the business case and who your personas are, your target customers, so that they can make the decisions on the ground. The tool unification police, also a fan of letting people use the tools that they like best for their jobs, as long as they can answer the questions that you want from them. Retrospectives and brainstorming are really hard. I think that brainstorming at the beginning of a project, you should get the team together if at all possible. But that kind of takes me down to the last one, which is if your travel budget is not doing that well, then it's really hard to justify, and those things get cut. Retrospectives are hard. I'm a big fan of retrospectives, and having just one remote person on the phone makes it a lot harder to walk around with sticky notes. So that has really curtailed the creativity that I like to bring to retrospectives. It's kind of sad to say that sometimes I'm glad that he's not able to be there, because that allows me to do something on the walls. And that's just a fact of remote teams when you're doing collaborative stuff that Agile likes to promote. And then UX, which is a whole bullet point by itself. Nick McClay said, I asked the UX guys what they thought about working with remote teams. and kind of a sadder look at it, and he says you can make it work, but at a terrible, terrible price, and that's basically the price of doing the 12-hour turnaround time with somebody on the other side. And then I think that our other UX guy kind of summed it up, that feeling that it makes it difficult for either team to feel like they own the product. Here's empathy, which is very good. I'm sure they feel like they're just implementing design. They feel like our design is being perverted, so everyone is disgruntled. So I think that the UX is particularly hard. You have to create more artifacts to communicate your design. When you're creating a sketch or wireframe as a UX person, you're always imagining more into that design that you can often talk to a developer about. But here you have to communicate it all through the digital artifact, and that's just really hard. And you also, if you look at the 37 signals about how their UX team works together, they go from sketch straight to a working prototype and back and forth with their dev team. So they work so closely together, which actually is interesting now that I think about it, because they're a lot of remote guys. I have to look into that a little bit more. But I was talking with Nick about that a little bit. Sorry to out you back there. So that's all I've got. I think we're just about a minute or two over. Anybody else have any other questions or comments about things that have worked well? Because this is all just from my 2 years working with remote teams. You were first.
In the previous slide, you showed prioritization was a challenge. Didn't understand how it was applicable in other groups, because that would be a challenge regardless if you are here or right. So is it specific to remote teams or something within your company that is?
So the question was, is prioritization really specific to remote teams or just within our company? I think that it's a pain that I feel within my company. I think that it's probably more natural to like the scaling of teams, where you have a lot of different people coming in with requests. So not necessarily remote, but I think that a lot of these remote things are the same as problems that you get when you scale Agile. So they kind of cross those boundaries. Oh, go ahead. You were next, actually.
Just real.
Yeah.
So you use sticky notes?
No, we don't.
Oh, okay.
Has left the conference.
The question was, do we use sticky notes with remote? And we don't typically. Actually, we did. That's not entirely true. When we do things like what went well, what didn't, or whatever, rosebud thorn variation,
Has left the conference.
we will often have a proxy that will write the notes for them and put them up there. So we have tried to make that work. Their task lists are all in Pivotal Tracker. So that's all who's assigned to the task, who picks it up. And we do a lot of pair programming in Pittsburgh, not as much with the guy in Utah. Which I've tried to point out that you can do remote pair programming. Some people love doing that, but we never really got that off the ground. In the back.
Yeah, I have I don't know, it's probably just for myself, I don't understand it really good. You have a slide called whole request. I see you have a code review and a design. Why this code review approach?
The question.
How the design should be designed.
Yeah, the question was about pull requests and how I had code review and design. That actually that wasn't ordered. No, those are just kind of three aspects that you can get out of a pull request. So the idea that you can, within a pull request, you can do, it serves a purpose of code review. The whole thing is a discussion, but it serves a purpose of a code review and designing at the same time. So, and it can kind of go back and forth too, because you can have many commits over time and many code reviews and then more design before you decide to push it all the way through or pull it. Any other questions from the room? the question was, I mentioned product managers and other roles across places. Do we have product owners? We have product owners. It's kind of one of my pet peeves is that they are product owners, but they don't have full authority of the product. So we have, I think that's where the prioritization thing falls apart, because we have product manager, which is supposed to be the voice of the market and the customer. Product managers talk to product owners, and but the product owners don't have as much say in what they sign up for. Does that sound familiar?
Product owner. What's that product manager?
So one of the things that like with the roles and responsibilities is I keep trying to get people to say who owns what, and we actually have a committee that acts as an Uber owner, which I feel like I've heard of. Jeff Patton, who's pretty popular, pretty famous in the UX and Agile circles. He advocates a 3-person PO, which is QA, Dev, and UX, I believe. So I think that can work, but we have a 6, which is like a committee that kind of acts as an Uber PO, and I'm not as big of a fan of that.
3 people for one team?
Yeah, 3 people for 1 PO for 1 team. So it's basically like they decide and look at all the issues. I mean, go ahead.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. The Google Hangout people have questions in the queue. Just want to.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
We have some questions on Google Hangouts. Maybe some complaints about our audio visual.
Yeah.
Did I leave a question hanging over here? Or was it? Okay. So I'm going to unmute. If there's anybody here, I can probably hear you too. I'm reading through the chat right now. Let's see. I'll move this over. Does that work? Nobody can really see that. Huh? No, never mind. Okay. We have some people waving from Vivissimo. If you make noises, your screen shows up in my Google Hangout. Very good. Okay. Tell us about the difference between a science fair and sprint demos.
Wait.
Multiple people on scope. G+.
Mute that one.
Yeah.
Here, we'll try with a different mic. Here, try then.
Okay. All right. So knowing which thing will use is visual. So the question was about
So the 2 big examples of
science fairs and sprint demos.
Oh, wait.
So when we had sprint reviews, which we did, I said we do almost all of the rituals and stuff of Agile with our team. We would do at the end of our 2-week sprints, we would have a 30-minute sprint review and then followed immediately by an hour retrospective every 2 weeks. The 30-minute sprint review, we tended not to get many stakeholders coming to them. So it was kind of, I like to do them just as an accountability thing so that people could see what they did on the team and have something to talk about. The science fair is, right now, the way that we've planned it, we haven't done one yet at Autodesk, but the science fair idea is, it's the same thing that you would get stakeholders to walk around and ask questions. It's very, very similar to sprint review. I think with less of an emphasis on what we did and what we didn't do as much as showing tangible proof of what you've done. So really just giving and creating more of a conversational environment than just somebody presenting. So really encourage to ask questions and to show their work, which is really, it's not that much different than a sprint review. The big difference is that you're really bringing in a lot of different teams and switching between them, like 10 minutes a team over the course of an hour. Or I think that our first one is scheduled for 2 hours. So we're going to feel that one out. Looking for another question.
Go.
So my question is that your 2 big examples of teams that have always worked really well distributed.
Yeah. The question was, do your thing 10 times? No, it's the way that the article that I found about it said that since they do it remotely, they can only do it one at a time. So it's one team, then second team, third team. When we did it in real space where everybody was in one big room, like a room like this, they would be set up around there, and like a science fair, you stand by your thing, and you can walk around and ask other people questions. So like a trade show or something like that, which I really liked. I thought that was a really good format. And we had beer so that people had, greased the conversations. So.
Cox, can you hear us?
Let's see.
Can you
Looks
hear
like
us?
people are trying to.
Hello?
I'm gonna unmute you guys. Oh, I can hear you
Can
now.
you hear us?
Have you been trying to talk to me because you've been muted?
You had us muted? Man, we've been trying so hard to talk to you. That's not nice.
Have you guys?
That's how you work with your remote teams. That blows.
Yeah.
But do you have a question?
Yeah.
So my question was that your two big examples of teams that worked really well remotely were GitHub and 37 Signals. From the sound of things, both those teams were born out of the open source community, which has been historically based, via email and just like forums. So they were always distributed. Now I was just curious is the distributed model something that's works well historically, just something that can be adapted to, or is that something that the team has to already do that coming into the organization? And just what's your opinion on that matter? Because it sounds like Autodesk kind of worked, and you basically brought it to them, but I don't know if that was more you wrestled it into the situation, or if that's something that everyone going into it was willing to agree. It's like Vivissimo now, we're trying to adapt to that situation because we have to, not because everyone.
Assessment that Autodesk kind of works. Did everybody kind of hear that? No, not at all. I was pointing this way. So he was pointing out that 37 Signals and GitHub, both coming from the open source community, they're used to communicating over email and through their code. Do you think that this distributed model would work in an organization that didn't grow up from the open source community? Is it something that they can adapt to? I think that we are pushing what we're calling internally is the open platform. The idea that we have Autodesk has a little under 7,000 employees, so fairly big, about 3,000 developers. And the idea is that we have projects that other people are dependent on. We're creating basically libraries. Ours is a viewing library that's in like 12 products right now. And they have needs that either go through our prioritization pipeline, or they can make the feature themselves and submit a pull request. And so we've been pushing this idea for about 9 months. But I would say that compared to 37 Signals and GitHub, that's not like core to how we operate. So it's more like just one more channel that comes into us that we have to manage. So I would say it only partially works. Because we have to advocate for spending time on reviewing pull requests, because it's not a free thing. It takes time, just like testing takes time. So I think that a lot of the stuff that I said at the beginning for the principles, clarity and vision and business plan, these are things that you can't just easily convince your company to do unless they're really flexible and open-minded. They sound like good ideas, I think, but I think that a lot of things like Agile transformations, they take a whole company buy-in to do, and I'm not convinced that. I think that GitHub specifically is an example that is really hard to emulate, and you can look at them from afar, almost like like going to a zoo or something and seeing what they do, because that would never work for a company that's not making a product for themselves. The other parts of GitHub, as a brief aside, if you're not familiar with their culture, is that they have no managers and they work on whatever they want to work on. That is absolutely true. I know 3 people that work there. They're like, yes, that's true. Please stop asking. Like everybody asks, and they're like, yes, it's still true. They're up to 130 employees. They literally only work on what they want to. It is a culture of open source. They hire the best people in the country or internationally, and it is mostly passion and peer pressure. So like they want to create something because everybody's creating something. So I think that is, for that reason, I think that you can't look to it for all of the examples. I think it's a very, very special place. Same way people, often make the mistake of looking at Apple and picking pieces of what they do. It's kind of a gestalt. So, any other questions from the Google Hangouts?
I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I really like your idea of getting a distributed team on Google Hangout, even though a bunch of them are in the same room. And we've certainly found that with unbalanced kinds of teams where there's a preponderance of people in one place with a few people in another. Do you have any other techniques for kind of equaling out that kind of that numerical imbalance?
So the question was about how we balance the playing field for the remote people by all being on Google Hangouts, and wondering if we have any other equalizers. Oh boy. I'm not sure if we do. Well, actually, that's not true. I think that the chat room is a pretty big equalizer. We all chat in the chat room. That brings the culture of the remote people. You know, we have our kind of team room, and we have what we call the party bus, where we put things that are marginally safe for work. And so we have that. We keep that kind of fun, upbeat thing as well. And I think that that's equally as important as being able to talk to people about what you're working on. You know, people get to know personality and how people work. Although at the same time, we have to realize that you know, we're not a monoculture, and it's kind of interesting because, you know, some people on the team don't like people that swear. So we have a swear jar, and we make sure that, you know, that we keep it to the level that everybody's comfortable with, and even when we're joking around. But so yeah, I guess that's the only other example that I have is HipChat is an equalizer, as well as Google Hangouts for stand-ups. Does anybody else have any equalizers like that?
It's really psychological thing.
Yeah.
They're already isolated, especially when you work from home. And when they see, I like how you're doing Google Hangouts and seeing their desk, because when everyone else is in the room and you're that one person looking in, faces or they're drawing something on the table, you can see all that.
Yeah.
But psychologically, now you don't feel like you're part of the team.
Right.
The other big thing, though, is like we were talking about science fairs, and you have beers for people for science fairs. Make sure there's something you can do for the person at home who's working from a remote location, so they feel like they're part of that thing. Don't have a Christmas party and you don't have the people who are at remote locations on the line doing it. Have them participate, even if it's mail ordering, they got their white elephant gift a week in advance or something.
Yeah,
like
the comment was about making people feel part of the team even when they're remote, like going as far as, you know, if you have a Christmas party or whatever, you know, do the white elephant, send it over mail or whatever, and if you're having beer in the office, you know, try to do something for the remote people. And that's something that is really, really tricky for us. I think that another thing that came to mind is that we have, I had an email alias that was our team name Pittsburgh, because it was really just the stuff in the office. And then the other guy noticed this, and because it'd be like, our team name is Firefly, so it's Firefly Pittsburgh and Jeff. And and he said, could you add me to the Firefly Pittsburgh alias? And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, we talk about, you know, like lunch orders and stuff, but he's like, no, that's fine, you know. So we did that, and I think that actually was important. Yeah, he's gonna, you know, find out about what we're getting for lunch sometimes, but it did, I think, make him feel like he was part of Firefly Pittsburgh. So. But I have to say that we don't go as far as having something for them for Christmas parties. But yeah, so we're about 20 minutes over. So I want to wrap it up there. Thanks for participating on Google Hangouts. And if you guys could talk about your experiences maybe in the message board or something like that, since this is the first time we've tried this. The success or failure, anything we could do better, or try some other tech for larger groups. I'd appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Great job.